Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Okay, well, welcome everyone to IRENA's second International Forum on long-term energy scenarios for the clean energy transition. My name is Paul Duran. I lead on innovation strategies at IRENA's Innovation and Technology Center. So before we get started, I want to introduce you briefly to the forum. This event is one of the activities under the Clean Energy Ministerial Campaign and the IRENA network on long-term energy scenarios for the clean energy transition. Now, the purpose of the campaign and the network is to promote the wider adoption, improved use of long-term energy scenarios in guiding the long-term transition to clean energy by promoting in-depth discussion amongst policymakers and experts. And the objective of today's International LTES Forum is threefold. We want to enable a deep dive discussion with subject matter experts. We want to raise awareness of the importance of long-term energy scenarios. And we want to take stock of good practices and discuss some of the key messages around those. Now, today's forum is going to have 6 thematic sessions. Each session is about an hour long and involves 3 to 4 input presentations, followed by about 20 minutes or so of moderated discussion. Now, this was originally planned as an in-person event in Berlin, but for obvious reasons, we're experimenting with this online approach. We are delighted that so many people have registered to join today's event. Do please bear with us if we encounter any technical issues. Organizing a full day event online with so many speakers is something of a logistical challenge. Just a few points to explain to help the day go smoothly. All our audience members are muted and will remain so throughout the webinar. If you have a question for the speaker, you can send it to us through the question tab, which you should see in the control panel, which is normally on the right-hand side of your screen. Questions you post there can only be reviewed by us, the organizers. They're not shared with the wider audience. We'll be monitoring the questions throughout the sessions, and we'll try and select some to be answered by our panelists towards the end of each session. Now, with so many people getting involved and due to time constraints, we will not be able to get to many of the questions that you post. So our apologies in advance if we've not answered your question. We will, however, collate them all and use them to inform our further work. Just to flag, this event is being recorded, and we hope that we'll be able to post those recordings on our website soon after the event. Likewise, with presentations, we hope and expect to be able to post most of the presentations online. If you have any technical difficulties, as is the tried and true way, please first try restarting the app. That seems to often work. If that doesn't work, then you can connect by dialing in via the phone. There's a number that you can see by clicking on the phone option located on the webinar panel under the audio tab. Make a note of that. If you're still having technical difficulties, then you can email us at ltes@irena.org. and we'll do our best to help you. I do hope that's all clear. We all very much hope this will run smoothly. So without further ado, let me introduce our opening speaker. Dolf Gielen is Director of IRENA's Innovation and Technology Center. Dolf, let me hand over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Paul. Can you hear me okay? Okay, so good morning to everyone. And welcome to the second International Forum on Long-Term Energy Scenarios for the Clean Energy Transition. I have prepared a few slides to introduce the topic. So if we move to the second slide on why long-term energy scenarios. So there are a number of important reasons. First of all, they are a fundamental tool for energy policy making. Many countries develop their national scenarios for national policy making, but also many international organizations, including IRENA, produce global scenarios to inform global policy debates. In fact, we will launch our new global scenarios in the coming weeks. There are a number of technical institutions that also produce various policy scenarios, a part of scientific exercise. And this approach has been around for many decades now. What is changed is that we have now a global drive for decarbonization. The urgency of climate change is increasing rapidly. For example, we are now increasingly asked also to look at decarbonization scenarios for 2050. And there is a lot of technological innovation, but the future evolution of energy systems is still very uncertain. And long-term energy scenarios are becoming a very important tool to guide us through the energy transition under uncertainty. This long-term vision is important to avoid, for example, stranded assets because of decisions with a too short time horizon, and also the need or the opportunity to tap into emerging solutions, so important innovations. There are a number of transformational changes that need to be reflected in such scenarios. One of them is high shares of variable renewable power. Another one is disruptive innovations in end-use sectors, and finally, digitalization and its impacts. So these are three examples of such dimensions. Moving to the next slide about the long-term energy scenarios for the Clean Energy Transition Campaign, or the LTES campaign. So this is something that started about 2 years ago under leadership of the German and Danish governments, and thanks very much for their strong support. And it's one of the work streams under the Clean Energy Ministerial. Apart from Germany and Denmark, 11 more countries have joined by now. So that's Brazil, Canada, Chile, Finland, Japan, the Netherlands, Mexico, the UK, the UAE, Italy, and recently also Saudi Arabia. And together with leading technical institutions such as, for example, IEA and CNREC, we are looking at how to develop better scenarios and how to support national governments in energy planning. On the IRENA side, to better integrate the LTES campaign also in our core activities and to benefit from our global membership beyond CEM countries, we launched the LTES network last year. So that network is open to all IRENA member countries, technical institutions supporting governments, and regional energy bodies and organizations, and it mirrors the campaign. So the aim of the campaign and the network is to become a vehicle to promote the effective use and development of long-term energy scenarios to guide the clean energy transition. Next slide, please. So what this slide shows is our mental model of the campaign and the network. So the long-term energy scenarios are a fundamental tool to produce insights for long-term energy policy making. And the modeling tools are a way to develop quantitative scenarios, to explore different pathways resulting from an array of policy and technology drivers. The scenario results and insights can be used to design the policies, and throughout the process of the modeling, of scenario development and the policy making, it's important to engage with the stakeholders. And the range of stakeholders is continuously growing as the impacts of energy transition, of course, impact all sectors of the economy. Next slide, please. So in terms of activities to date, we had the first LTES International Forum last year. It gathered around 130 experts from over 35 countries. Over the last 2 years, we've held about 20 thematic side events to explore good practices around the world. In spring of last year, we conducted a series of webinars with over 20 speakers and over 500 participants. And online, you can find the publication, Long-Term Energy Scenarios for the Clean Energy Transition, first-year campaign findings, that summarizes the outcomes to date. Next slide, please. So this week was supposed to be the Berlin Energy Transition Dialogue that was canceled this year, of course, because of the COVID pandemic. We had planned this event as a face-to-face event in Berlin on the sidelines of the BETD, but instead now we have this online forum. Today is set up as a deep dive discussion with experts, stock taking of good practices and discussion of key messages, and a discussion of how to raise awareness of the importance of long-term energy scenarios for policy making for energy transition. We have structured it into a set of discussions that hopefully are of interest. You see an overview here on this slide. So the first session is about electrification. The second one is about the assumptions and the narratives for the scenarios. The third one is about how to engage stakeholders. The fourth one is about the systemic innovation on the demand side and consumer behavior. A fifth one on the scenario development process, and a final one on how to deal with risk and systemic innovation for policy making. So that concludes my introductory remarks, and now we can immediately then move into session 1, and I'll be your moderator for session 1. So the topic is electrification scenarios for a carbon neutral energy system by 2050. So by electrification is used in energy circles in two ways. First of all, it's a term for providing electricity for those that don't have electricity. That's not what we're discussing in this session. We're talking about electrification as a strategy to replace direct fossil fuel use in buildings, in industry, and in transport. And that can be an important strategy to mitigate also CO2 emissions if you combine it with clean carbon neutral electricity supply, and of course we are very much focused on renewables in that context. So this session discusses the perspectives of the electricity industry on crucial technological and societal transformations needed to accelerate electrification of these end-use sectors. It will also provide a platform to discuss the readiness in planning for large-scale electrification as a means to achieving a carbon neutral energy system by 2050. So do we have the models and do we have the scenarios to support the policy making for this transition? You can also submit questions. You have a chat option on your panel, and we will try to accommodate some of these questions in the Q&A session, in the Q&A round at the end of this session. So now I would like to invite our first presenter, Marc McGranaghan, Vice President of Innovation at the Electric Power Research Institute in the United States, for a 10-minute presentation. And following Marc's presentation, I will introduce and invite our other two presenters. Marc, can I hand you the floor, please?
Unmuted, okay. Hi, Marc McGranaghan here. I'm with the Electric Power Research Institute. I'm the Vice President of Innovation. I've been involved with EPRI virtually my whole career and been working there since 2003, so for the last 17 years. I'm coming to you from my Dublin, Ireland home office. We have a European subsidiary called EPRI Europe, where the headquarters is here in Dublin, and I often work from this office, especially for coordination with our European members. For those of you that are not familiar with EPRI, EPRI is a nonprofit organization in the United States with a public benefit mission. Matter of fact, yesterday our advisory council, which is made up of regulators and policymakers and other stakeholders that are not electric utilities, that provide guidance to EPRI on our public benefit mission. But we're a collaborative organization that's funded primarily by electric utilities from around the world. And one of the things that we work on are long-term energy modeling and scenarios. And I thought I would start out by discussing a study that we completed a little over a year ago that we call the U.S. National Electrification Assessment, looking at electrification potential and impacts in the United States. Go to the next slide. Thank you. And this assessment, this modeling effort, was designed to look at the impacts of different scenarios of electrification, taking into account the technology progression in electrification, both in transportation as well as heating and cooling and numerous industrial applications for electrification as well, and looking at the economics of customer adoption of these electrification technologies and the resulting impacts on electricity use, decarbonization, and the overall requirements for the grid to supply this. Next slide. The modeling tool that we use for these energy modeling efforts is called the US Regen model. EPRI's been using this model for a number of years. It's a representation of both the economy and energy use and energy production in the United States that we've been progressing for a number of years. And the important element, especially for this electrification assessment, is that it includes a detailed model of both the electric production side, the electric generation, energy and capacity requirements and economics that's solved on an hourly basis, along with a detailed representation of the demand side of the energy use and technology representation in all of the energy use sectors, in the transportation sector, the industrial sector, the building sector of energy use, and how that can change depending on the costs and technology availability for that energy. So that combined effort we use the combined modeling capability we use to look at different scenarios for electrification going forward. We actually used 4 scenarios in the analysis, a kind of conservative scenario, what we call a base scenario, and then 2 scenarios that had a price on carbon to further push the electrification adoption in between now and 2050. So on the next slide, maybe we can just look at the results of one of these scenarios to illustrate the impacts that we see. And this is what we call a transformation scenario, where there was a $50 price on carbon that started in 2020 throughout to 2050. And in the U.S., electric use of the total energy use was 21% in 2015, and you can see on the left that this increases in this transformation scenario to 47% of the total energy use through electrification. In all the scenarios, the percentage of the total energy picture that is electric increases dramatically, ranges from 32% to 47% across the scenario. So kind of regardless of the scenario, we see electrification occurring as a result of technology advancement and just cost factors in general, dominated by electric transportation, but many technologies in the industrial sector and the building sector being electrified as well. But I think the important thing that you get from the graph on the left is the dramatic efficiency improvements that result both from ongoing efficiency improvements in electricity use in general, and we call it the 4th wave of efficiency that I think that is going to be enabled by things like artificial intelligence and digitalization and optimizing the use of electricity in general. But electrification itself has dramatic efficiency improvements as well compared to the use of fossil fuels in many applications. So you see both the efficiency improvements and the efficiency improvements that are just due to electrification on that left-hand chart. And it does result in, on the right-hand chart, just illustrates even with those efficiency improvements, due to the electrification, we see growth of the electric use. And in this transformation scenario, the growth is approximately 50% compared to the 2015 use of electricity. And that occurs despite the efficiency improvements because of the electrification of buildings and industry, and especially transportation over that period. So you do see significant growth in electric use, and that of course has impacts on the electric system, the grid infrastructure requirements to support that. And if we look at the hourly by hourly simulations, we can see the impacts on demand, not only just energy use, but demand is very important to look at in terms of the grid infrastructure requirements. Next slide. And so when we look at the impact on carbon, on CO2 emissions resulting from this electrification, in the US, we hit our peak of about 6 gigatons of carbon per year. And that has reduced primarily due to the switch from coal to natural gas in the US, but also as a result of continued renewable adoption and economics of renewables. And you can see going forward, the impact of electrification itself can be very dramatic as the source of electricity becomes cleaner over time, makes the impact of electrification even more dramatic. So it's kind of like the switch to electrification is a technology change that keeps on giving as the decarbonization of the electric sector occurs through further adoption of renewables over time. And beyond 2030, hopefully, even further reduction in the carbon content of the electric sector through technologies like hydrogen and low carbon fuels, which we'll talk about in a moment. So we do see very dramatic changes in the decarbonization as a result of the electrification. Matter of fact, it's the primary driver, especially in the next 10 years, to make progress on the decarbonization front. We get that benefit from decarbonization of some of the other energy sectors that are the other 80% of our energy use in 2015. So very exciting results looking at that. Next slide is kind of where do we go from here? We can see the benefit that we get from electrification, and that's going to be a big driver between now and 2030, along with continued adoption of renewables. But beyond 2030, to get from and we think we can get to from 5 gigatons to 4 gigatons between now and 2030, primarily with electrification. But as we try to get all the way down to almost zero carbon in the electric sector, that's going to take some fundamental technology changes in the electric energy production and storage. So we really need to have to get that last bit of decarbonization to change from using natural gas for the flexibility requirements of the grid, and be able to have storage options that are beyond the capability of probably battery storage to provide weeks of storage, and even seasonal storage are going to be required. So we have an initiative that we're just starting called the Low Carbon Resources Initiative to really look at the role of hydrogen and other low carbon resources, where the technologies are going, transportation of those technologies, storage of those technologies, to be part of the energy picture, especially beyond 2030. We think this effort is a tremendous opportunity for collaboration around the world, and together with electrification, really is the answer for getting us to the long-term decarbonization goals. So this is the energy scenarios associated with the low carbon fuels is kind of the next step to work along with electrification going forward. So that's a short introduction to the U.S. National Electrification Assessment. We are in the process of working on more granular, detailed energy scenario work for individual states in the United States. We finished a New York electrification assessment, and when we get down to the individual state levels, we can really look at the impact of the electrification on the grid infrastructure requirements, on a demand picture that the electric system is going to have to deal with associated with that electrification, as well as the unique aspects of the industry and customers and buildings in those states, and what electrification technologies make the most sense. So that's an ongoing effort, and I think will help with policy development and choices in terms of investment at the regional and state level. That will be a little bit more useful than looking at it at the large picture of the whole country, which involves many different scenarios kind of combined together. So that's a short introduction from the EPRI side, and I look forward to the discussion and questions going forward.
Thank you very much, Mark. That is very interesting, and we'll come back to this. I think there will be many questions after the other two presentations. Now I would like to move to the second presenter. This is Dante Powell. He's the Senior Market Modeling Specialist from the European Network of Transmission System Operators for Electricity, ENTSO-E. Dante, thank you very much for joining, and the floor is yours. We cannot hear you.
Okay, and now are you able to hear me?
Now we can hear you. Yes, it works.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so my name is Dante Powell. I work for the European Network of Transmission System Operators for Electricity, where I am a senior long-term planning specialist. So my main roles are to look at the future energy scenarios for both electricity and gas. It's important to say that we actually work with the European Network of Transmission System Operators for gas in order to build joint scenarios, looking at the EU energy mix going up to 2050. So this means that we have around 80 TSOs in Europe from both the electricity and the gas side, which are inputting their national views in terms of the energy transition up to 2050 into a joint scenario effort. So if we move to the next slide. So in the 2020 scenario building process, well, the scenario building process is a rolling process. So every 2 years, we build these scenarios for the 10-year network development plan. In this plan, it really looks at the infrastructure needs for both gas and electricity in Europe. So it looks at the bidding zones. As you increase the amount of electrification, as you change the energy mix, what's then the need for grid reinforcement and grid infrastructure, and the scenarios are the main input source for these studies, and that project is also run every 2 years, which then goes into the PCI process, which is led by the European Commission, and in that they look at the projects which have been submitted to the program. And if the benefits from the projects are suitable to reducing system costs in Europe, then there's the potential that they will get particular funding from the European Commission. So in this framework, in the framework of scenarios, we have 3 scenarios. The first one is national trends. This is really a policy scenario, and what we tried to do this year was align all the national energy and climate plans of the EU member states. So that's to achieve 32% reduction of gross final electricity and 32.5% efficiency. In reality, this scenario goes up to 2030, but we try to extend this to 2040. And then we have more of a qualitative view of 2050, which looks at a 80 to 90%, 95% CO2 reduction. The other 2 scenarios, which are the distributed energy and global ambition, are actually top-down scenarios. So we approach this scenario building phase from a central view, with the main inputs being the COP21 target. So how do we achieve 1.5 degrees with a 66.7% probability for both scenarios? And then we feed this down into the different countries within Europe. We take 2 approaches to this. The first is the distributed energy scenario. So this looks at more of a prosumer approach, so more active customer management, more small-scale solutions, more development of the distributed infrastructure. And then the global ambition looks at more closer to business as usual as what we have today. So we have quite a lot of imports at the moment. It looks at the ability to build out large-scale renewable technologies such as offshore wind farms, solar, onshore wind farms. So it takes more of a global approach to solving the COP21 targets. The target actually for the two top-down scenarios is a carbon budget approach. So at 2050, the scenarios both achieve a CO2 budget of around 65 gigatons of CO2 of cumulative GHG emission. The target is 47.5, but we see that there will be more actions that will need to be done after 2050 in order to remove these excess carbon emissions. If we move to the next slide. So this slide is very similar to what I was describing in the last slide. Really, it describes the carbon budget and the way that we see CO2 emissions increasing in the EU 28 energy sector, in the total energy sector. And the key messages that we get from the scenario approach is that in order to meet these COP21 targets, a strong development of renewables is essential. But it's also necessary to clean up the gas system as well. So we need to look at renewable and decarbonized gases. These also need to be coupled with other technologies such as carbon capture technologies, so that's storage, carbon capture and usage, and also LULUCF, so that's land use and land use change with forestry. And as mentioned before, at the 2050 point, we reach around 65 gigatons of CO2. But additional measures would be required after 2050 in order to bring that down to the 47.5 gigatons of CO2 equivalent. This, just to mention, this is using the population approach rather than the equity approach. So that's how we set our carbon budget in terms of these scenarios. If we move to the next slide. So we know that the role of electrification will play a very big role in terms of the energy transition going up to 2050. Actually, what we see, the kind of elements we see are very similar to what Marc was showing in his slide pack. So in 2015, you can see that 55% of the energy mix is really other fuels. So these other fuels are mainly coal, oils, and other kind of solid fuels, lignite fuels like this. There's 23% of methane in that scenario. So this is natural gas, so unabated natural gas. And then 22% of electricity. So the electricity mix is only electrified 22%. You see that as we move to 2030, the solid fuels and the more carbon intensive fuels are reduced by 10%. So this goes down to 45%. We see an increase of electrification, which goes up to 30%, but then you also start seeing other fuels starting to creep in. So in 2030, you start seeing hydrogen, so the need for hydrogen. And this can be hydrogen for power to gas. It can also be hydrogen for power to liquid, so going into ammonia fuels. And then in 2050, then you see really quite a big paradigm shift where we go up to 55%. Another point is that we do a stakeholder engagement with the scenarios. Previous to that consultation, the electrification for the 2050 mix was 48%. But we tried to take on as much as possible the stakeholder feedback, and we did some realignment of the scenarios, shifted some fuels from biofuels, from other fuels, and we saw the need for more electrification. So in the final scenario, we see around 55%, which is a huge increase as compared to 2015. Actually, more than double the electrification is required. But you actually can see that there's 12% of hydrogen that's needed for the energy mix, and there's also 12% of e-liquids. So these are both sources that come from, well, the e-liquids at least come from electrification through power to X, and the hydrogen comes from different sources. So it may be power to X, it may be steam methane reforming, but we do see the need to introduce more hydrogen into the energy mix. And in the middle of the circles, this shows the final end-use demand for all sectors. And you can see that as the electrification increases, you can see that we do see some efficiency gains. So from 12,700 in 2015, we go down to around 7,500 in 2050. So it's almost half. It's almost halving the final end-use demand. And this really highlights the efficiency gains that you can see in the sectors by increasing the amount of electrification. On the right side, you can see that there's two lines there. So I mentioned at the start, there's two scenarios, top down. One is the distributed energy, which is the more decentralized. The other is the global ambition, which is the more global. So we try to get a range of energy futures in order to put into the TYNDP, so we can really have a look at what's the need for infrastructure in different energy futures. One where there's more electrification and the other where there's 10% less electrification. But regardless, this you still see, even in the global ambition scenario, that there's almost a doubling of the electrification. And also interesting to mention that this rate of electrification is direct demand electrification. As mentioned, there is a strong need for power to X fuels, and this is essential, we see in terms of decarbonizing the energy mix. So if we go to the next slide. In terms of electricity generation, what I really want to point out is the first three, so the yellow, the dark green, and the green colors on the graphs. And this really shows that in 2025, you see quite a small amount, so less than 1,000 terawatt hours, which is used to meet the energy mix. But actually, when you go up to 2050, you see this almost tripling. So you see 3 times this in the distributed energy scenario. In the global ambition, and the national trend scenario, this doubles. Also important to note that coal is phased pretty much out of the market by 2040. And this is really a drive to reach full decarbonization of the energy mix by 2040. There is still some emissions in 2040, but as the rest of the gas is clean by 2050, you will see full decarbonization of the electricity mix. And then on the top of the chart, you can see some colors outlined in purple, and this is really the supply that we would supply to power to X technologies. So in the distributed energy scenario, we see up to 2,571 terawatt hours of clean energy, which is required in order to supply this power to X. So you see in the 3 scenarios, in distributed energies, it's quite a high amount. In global ambition, there's significantly less, and then in national trends, there's almost none. So this really shows the spectrum of the needs for direct and indirect electrification in the ENTSO scenarios. If we move to the next slide. Of course, very important, what is the effect on demand? So in the distributed energy scenario, which is the pink scenario, this is again the scenario with the most electrification. This is the scenario with the most resources in the distributed networks. Therefore, you see the highest increase of electricity demand in this scenario. But if you look on the right and you look at the peak demand, There is an increase in peak demand in 2040 and of course in 2050, but this peak demand is actually subsided a little bit by the demand side resources. So for us, it's very important that the development of the demand side network is done in tandem with the development of the transmission network. So what do we see in terms of the need for batteries for demand side response, be it in the transport sector from vehicle to grid, be it in the industry sector, tertiary, the need for smart grids where consumer goods can regulate when they turn on, turn off, and many other rooftop solar battery systems. What are the trends that we see for this? We try to include some technologies in the creation of the demand profiles, but actually what we need to do is work a little bit closer with the distributed system operators in order to get a better look at what the future system will be, and have an aligned scenario which takes into account both the transition of the transmission network and the distributed network. We see this as essential in terms of creating solid planning for future scenarios. So if we go to the next slide. So of course, one of the main and the most important factors for us in ENTSO-E is the electricity grid infrastructure. Essentially, this at the end of the TYNDP, we look at the needs for the electricity grid infrastructure, which then goes to the European Commission. So it's very interesting to see what we see from the scenario. So how flows change around Europe and where they go, how they're centralized, do they move from north to south or east to west. So in distributed energy, it's the scenario with the highest uptake of solar technologies. And because of this, you see that there's a great need of the shift of electricity flows from the south up to the north, as the best resources in Europe are actually in the south. Whereas in Global Ambition, it focuses more on the big offshore wind parks, the big onshore wind parks. So in this scenario, you see more flow of electricity going from the west to the east. And then in the national trends, you see more of a centralized view, as it is a mix between the two scenarios. So you have more of a balanced renewable outlook. But this is very important to identifying what the needs of the system are, where we see the flows will go, and what the requirements for new infrastructure projects will be in Europe. So there will be a much deeper assessment of this in the TYNDP project, where we go into a deeper granularity of areas, and the outcomes of that will be published in the TYNDP later this year. So that was a very quick overview of the TYNDP scenarios, and thank you for time and listening.
Thank you very much, Dante. That was indeed very interesting, and we'll come back to that after our last speaker. I'm very happy now to welcome Kristian Ruby, Secretary General for Eurelectric. Kristian, can I give you the floor, please?
Thank you, Dolf, and thank you for setting up this this very important webinar. I think it's a very important and interesting exercise, and the presentations we've seen from Marc and Dante basically show that this exercise of having long-term scenarios and being able to have the discussion about policy and long-term developments in the energy system on the basis of very intelligent and very thorough scenarios, forecasts is hugely valuable for the policy process. In Eurelectric, we've done the same type of work. We did it on the background of our vision, which is to create a thriving European economy powered by carbon neutral energy. We see the role of electricity, of course, as utilities, as being absolutely crucial in this process, and we have set out to see if we can decarbonize faster than any other sector and become carbon neutral well before mid-century. So that's the vision of the sector, and to back this up with hard analysis and facts and figures, we engaged with McKinsey back in 2018 and developed the study called Decarbonisation Pathways, which basically looks at what it takes to bring the entire European economy to a carbon neutral state by 2050, and what that implies for the power sector, but also for the end use sectors. And I think we can sum up the conclusion to being that electricity will be for the 21st century what oil was for the 20th century, namely the key energy vector, the shaping energy vector of society. If we move to the next slide, we have an overview of the scenarios we modeled. You have the baseline of 2015, where we have a little bit similar to the US, an overall electrification rate just above 20%, and carbon emissions gone down also around 20% since 1990. The three scenarios we modeled are all 2050 scenarios, one that looks at 80% emission reductions, one that looks at 90% emission reductions, and one that goes close towards a full decarbonization in the energy sector. And what we find there is very similar to what Dante and Marc have both presented. We find electrification rates in the range of 50 to 60% if we are looking at a very deep or full decarbonization of the economy. We also see a role, and that's what we try to show at the bottom of this slide, for what we call indirect electrification. That is power fuels, gases, energy vectors based on electricity, but they play more of a complementary role in the setup. If we move to the next slide, we take a look here at the implications for the power mix. And I think the first observation you should make is that on all the time scales, we are looking at the power mix in 2045. As I said, we endeavor as a sector to become carbon neutral well before mid-century, and that can be achieved probably around 2045, and perhaps even earlier if we foresee additional actions. What's also very interesting is that as we move forward towards the mid-30s and towards 2040, we have indeed an almost full phase out of coal, and we have some remaining gas turbines in the mix, but they play a role as backup. That means that by the mid-30s, we're looking at a very low carbon power mix in Europe, not a fully carbon neutral power mix, but a low carbon power mix already in the mid-30s, and then going towards the full decarbonization in the mid-40s. If we look at the amount of electricity produced, we see in all scenarios a significant ramp up in order to cater for the increased electrification of end-use sectors. What we also see is, of course, a significant shift in the power mix with cost-effective and very attractive renewables taking the lion's share of the mix, strong growth for onshore wind, strong growth for solar in all scenarios. You may argue that why is solar not even bigger in these scenarios? Well, this is the output. And if you look at the installed capacity, this is significantly bigger, and that's basically due to the capacity factors of solar. So when we look at the energy produced, wind will play a bigger role than solar, at least in our modeling. What you also see, of course, is a significant, I would say even radical increase of the role of offshore wind. If we look at the right-hand scenario where renewables take 82% of all electricity by 2045, we are talking ballpark figures of 450 gigawatts of offshore wind and that is up from some 20 gigawatts today. So you see, we are talking about a very, very significant and massive industrial mobilization, which will be required to achieve these results. Nevertheless, we insist that this is feasible, but it really requires significant political will to make this happen. If we look at the next slide, this is the other side of the equation, if you will. For us, the energy transition is really a twin challenge, which on the one hand consists in a fundamental transformation of energy production in society, as well as a fundamental shift in the energy consumption in society. On top of the slide, you have the total picture, as I mentioned before, and below we've broken it down in the three major end-use sectors. We have the transport sector as the first one, and I want to be very clear that this band signifies the entire transport sector, so also the maritime and the aviation segments, as well as passenger cars. And if we look at that segment today, we have an electrification rate, so an electricity share in the power in the energy consumption of 1%. That would need to go up to 63% in order to deliver on the full decarbonization. The same in buildings, where we already have a certain electrification rate due to the electric appliances. We all have the electric light and so on and so forth, but we would need to see more electric energy use in buildings, electrification of heating, just to take one example, and the overall electricity share in buildings would need to go to 63% as well. Last but not least, we would need to see a significant ramp up also in industries, where we'd go from the 33% electricity used today to around 50% by 2050. So now when you put this in a slide, it looks like, okay, we can do that. We just need to ramp up here and there. Let's be very clear. We are talking about the rollout of millions and millions of charging points for electric vehicles. We're talking about a full shift to electric vehicles for passenger cars by 2050. We're talking about at least half of all buses going electric. We're talking about a significant share also of heavy-duty vehicles going electric to make this happen. We're talking millions of heat pumps in buildings, and we're talking revamping of industrial processes. So again, this is feasible, but it requires focused political strategies as well as action, both from the industry side, from policy side, and from consumers. Next slide. It also requires investments. I think that the good news is that the investments needed are lower than we had thought a few years ago. We used to think that this would cost a lot of money, and what we're seeing in part due to the cost reductions of renewables is that these figures are coming down significantly. So the annual investments needed are declining, but they're still not on par with what we're investing today. So we need to see a ramp up of investments both in the generation space, in storage, and also significantly in grids, which is not part of this slide I'm presenting here. And I think to be very clear, we have a Green Deal discussion in Europe, and we're talking about mobilizing in the ballpark of 1 trillion euros over the next decade. That will do part of the job, but we actually need to see more action. We need to see more investments, and we need to have an urgent dialogue with policymakers about how we make that happen. If we take the last slide, I would sum this up. There's a lot of text there. I would sum that up in people, partners, and pace as three key levers to deal with. People is the fact that the energy transition is now moving into a phase where we absolutely depend on an active engagement of consumers. Consumers need to buy electric cars. Consumers need to play ball when it comes to insulating their own homes. They need to also start looking at a different type of energy use in their own houses and homes. they need to deploy decentral renewable solutions, and they need to also structure their demand after when the resource is actually there, and actively engage in demand-side response schemes with their utilities and or their energy communities. Partners is about the fact that we need to rewire the energy system. We need to look at the sector integration that Dante was mentioning. How does the electricity system play together with the gas system? How do we get volumes into the production of power fuels, of hydrogen, and how do we connect the electricity system with the district heating systems? Increasingly, we'll need to electrify those as well in order to decarbonize them fully. So the energy transition requires new partnerships across sectors, across traditional dividing lines. And last but not least, we need to engage ourselves with the pace challenge. As I said, the investments are not following the pace that the science is requiring and that the policymakers have set out as their ambition. So we need to have a dialogue about how we can align the pace of the transition with the political ambition. And I think as a closing remark, the current corona situation across the globe provides us with a huge risk of basically forgetting about this transition, but also a huge opportunity to direct the funds that are aimed at ensuring economic recovery towards the right investments in the energy system, in charging infrastructure, in electric car scrapping schemes that allow us to accelerate the fleet transformation in passenger cars, in distribution grids, in industrial heat pumps, and so on and so forth. If we recover the economy as it was 3 weeks ago, then we're going to have a bigger challenge than if we think about this recovery in terms of a green transition, an accelerated green transition. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kristian. So this completes our 3 presentations. If you allow me to try to summarize the findings regarding electrification. So Marc had a number of 47% for the US, but if I understood correctly, that was excluding hydrogen and e-fuels or power fuels. Then Dante presented 45 to 55% for Europe, but on top of that, he had hydrogen and e-liquids each at 12%. I don't know if that should be added, then these percentages to the electrification. And Kristian presented for Europe 38 to 60% with an additional 4 to 5% for indirect electrification. So there seems to be a consensus that electrification with renewable power is really a key pillar, maybe the key pillar for energy transition. But there is still a bit of let's say you have to be careful if you see a percentage number. You have to understand whether it's only the direct one or whether the indirect one is also included. And so that makes can make a big difference. As I said at the beginning, I wanted to give you a first opportunity to respond to the other 2 presentations you heard. Marc, can I start with you, please?
Yeah, so thanks a lot, and Dante and Kristian, appreciate both of the presentations, and I think the consistency of the results is pretty apparent in terms of the importance of electrification in general. And your points about the longer term scenario and the role of indirect electrification of producing hydrogen and using hydrogen as a fuel for, say, some of the larger trucks and shipping and other forms of transportation that are very difficult to electrify in the straight electrification method an important element, and I would say a big unknown and an opportunity for significant discussion in the longer term aspects of the scenario. So look forward to that collaboration.
Dante, any immediate reactions?
Yeah, sure. So, yeah, I think it's actually great that we see more or less the same trends. I mean, the question of indirect electrification is still ongoing. There's still a lot of questions about it. How do we operate this? How do we integrate these into the markets? Who will be the market operators? But when you look at the direct electrification, you see this is what everyone more or less sees as the path in terms of the role of electrification. Because I've never seen the study from EPRI up until now, and it's very much in line with what we're saying, and even the comments on the need for demand and the hourly demand profiles. I think it's it's great that we see the same direction. Eurelectric, I think it's a good study. I think you have good connections with the DSO industries. I think in terms of the transport, ours is a little bit lower than yours, but it would be great for us to all work together to see a common view in terms of Europe and the whole world of how we can decarbonize these different industries. I mean, Kristian highlighted the challenges that you see numbers on a page, but actually when you translate this into real world efforts, it's a real paradigm shift in terms of the energy mix. But what we really need to do is, get the political backing for it, get the market designs ready for it. I mean, more than anything, we'll work together in order to try to achieve the similar goal. Everyone has a similar goal here.
Kristian, you want to react?
Yes, Dolf. To your remarks about the ranges that we were seeing across the studies, I think it's important to make the footnote on the Eurelectric study that the first scenario that has an electrification rate of 38 is a emission reduction of 80%. So it's basically, I would say, outside the scope of the current discussion about deep decarbonization. As soon as we look at 90% emission reductions in the energy system or going towards 100, we are in the range of 50 to 55 or 48 to be specific to 16 in our scenario, which is very, very close to what Dante and Marc were showing. So I think there's really an emerging consensus about this range as the role for direct electrification. With regard to the hydrogen, the power to X, I think that we in Eurelectric remain open to having our views evolve here, because to be very honest, this is also an evolving space technologically speaking. If we look at the role of different energy vectors, for example, in heavy duty trucks, in the maritime space and in aviation, well, we don't really know, any of us, how this is going to go, because the OEMs have not made their decisions, the operators have not made their decisions, and there's a diversity of technologies out there. So this can change, and we have to also acknowledge, I think, that these exercises will need to be repeated, whether it's every 2 years or 3 to 5 years, as the technology evolves, and these figures may change. What's really important to establish here is that there's a strong consensus and a remarkable, let's say, proximity in the findings when it comes to direct electrification.
Please. Indeed. I would like to move to a question from the audience. Kristian, you already alluded to the recent Corona crisis and how that could impact the policies, but would it also impact the scenarios? Well, if you would make these scenarios now, would they be different than what you presented? Does any one of you want to react to that? Maybe we go again down the list. Marc, you want to start?
The question is related to the prices up for electric cars, and
No, the question is, given the current Corona crisis.
Oh, okay.
Would if you made the study again today, would it change anything?
I think that's a big unknown in terms of what the long-term impact of this crisis is going to be. If it's if the optimistic scenario that these stimulus efforts, we're talking a $1 trillion stimulus opportunity in the US, which goes to some of Kristian's comments about if we can come up with $1 trillion to recover from the coronavirus in terms of stimulating the economy to recover. I would hope that we can come up with the policy decisions to invest in the longer term technologies and infrastructure requirements to support decarbonization as well. But if these stimulus efforts essentially restart the economy and we end up with a delay of a year in the way things work, that I don't think that changes things very much. But there is potential that if this is going to result in a recession and significant changes in the way investments are made, then I think that more dramatic impacts are possible, and we have to take a look at these long-term scenarios. But we can't ignore what's required for the decarbonization in the long term, regardless, as we restart the economy and get things going again. I think all of these initiatives and priorities that we talk about in these scenarios are still front and center.
Thank you. Dante, you want to react to this?
Yeah, sure. So I agree. It's very difficult to say what the economical impact will be on this and how that redistribution of finances will how the coronavirus will impact the redistribution of finances. I think there could be a lot of lessons learned that we get from the crisis. In the 2008 economic crisis and 2008 recession, we saw a huge decline in the CO2 emissions in Europe, and it had a big effect on the emissions trading scheme in Europe. And there were lessons that could have been learned from that in terms of the holes in those systems. But it also shows, okay, because of this coronavirus, there's actually new trends in society. We've seen, looking at the demand profiles of most countries that are on lockdown, that actually demand is significantly reduced, and we're forced into working in a new way. And that's really a paradigm shift to what we're used to now. So I think it would be important to see, okay, what's actually the limits of what we can do in terms of using technology, how industries operate, what was the impact in terms of CO2 emissions in the world due to the coronavirus impact. I would say that I don't know if the long-term vision would change, but potentially it could have some impacts on demand in terms of being a little bit more efficient, using a little bit more technology in terms of how we commute. But for now, I would have to maybe wait another 6 months to see what are the economic impacts, what are the trends, and what lessons we can take from the actions of the government.
Thank you very much. Kristian, I think you already addressed this point, so I want to ask you another question. Another important part of the energy system today is the natural gas industry. And they develop their own scenarios, and of course they say that natural gas is very important and critical for the energy transition. did you have a discussion with the gas industry on your scenarios, and how do they look at this?
Well, we have an ongoing discussion with a number of gas stakeholders with regard to how to actually achieve the long-term objectives. I think what's really interesting is that the exercise that Dante was referring is one which takes an integrated approach, one which basically represents the transmission system operators of gas and electricity, and they come to similar results when it comes to the electrification rates as us. For one of their scenarios, it's somewhat lower, but the other scenarios are similar. If we're looking at other gas players, such as Gas for Climate, another influential study by an alliance of transmission system operators, they arrive at the exact same results when it comes to the technological approach and the systemic approach to this change. So even if you represent another type of energy, you are forced to acknowledge that let's say the fundamentals are pointing in a certain direction when it comes to the role of electrification. Then, of course, we have the question, what about gas? What about the role of gas, and how exactly is that going to play out? In the longer term, I would say perhaps there's less disagreement. The short and medium term, the issue of security of supply will be important, not least due to the current situation where society really relies on stable energy supply.
I might add that in the low carbon resource initiative that I described, that is jointly sponsored by the Gas Technology Institute in the U.S. and in our scenarios in the U.S. National Electrification Study, the role of natural gas continues to be critical right out to 2050 in terms of source of flexibility, and in the longer term scenarios of carbon capture, utilization, and storage. Right now the cost projections, related to hydrogen and other low carbon fuels compared to gas with carbon capture, there's a lot of questions in terms of where the best economics will result, even in the deep decarbonization scenarios.
And that could be a difference between the US and Europe, because at the moment you have wholesale prices for natural gas in the US, I think, of $2 per million BTU. And in Europe, we're like 3 times that level.
$4 for that whole period to 2050.
Okay. We have many other questions received, but we have to wrap up in the next 3 minutes, I'm told. So maybe we can also have an exchange after today and try to answer some of these questions. So what we've seen is that there is a consensus that electrification is critical for the energy transition. We've seen this now for 2 key regions of the world. I've also seen similar studies, for example, for China, and so it seems to be a global consensus, and it seems to be an outcome of many different modeling frameworks. But of course, translation of these findings into policy is a whole different matter, and that requires a lot of attention. I wanted to give you a last chance to make any comments if you wanted. Marc, can I start with you?
Okay, thanks. Let me just highlight 3 things that I think are absolutely critical, and one Kristian mentioned, which is offshore wind. I think that's has huge potential. Here in Ireland, we're talking about, if we include West Coast offshore wind, like 75 to 85 gigawatts of offshore wind for a country that has 5 gigawatts of demand. So, that as a potential huge driver in terms of how do we take advantage of all that capacity and where do we put it. The other is one that Dante highlighted in terms of the smart grid, and I think and then coronavirus emphasizes this as well, and that is the role of the community and decentralization, both in terms of resilience, electrification, managing energy use. And I think a trend that will be very important is the growing importance of community management and responsibility for resources and energy use. So I'll just highlight those two things in addition to our discussion that we've had.
Thank you very much, Mark. Dante, please.
Yeah, so my last comments would really be, so we kind of see the path that we need to take in order to meet full decarbonisation and the COP21 targets. I think that a lot more work needs to be done on the economics of things. I think a lot more work needs to be done in looking at the different policy instruments. So non-market-based policies as well as market-based need to be combined in order to push these new technologies forward in order to really make this change at the rate that we need. We have these scenarios and we kind of know what to do on paper, but actually the hard part is actually doing it and being addressing these comments to the right people that will make those decisions and saying, okay, here's what we need to do. Understand it's not an easy task. Economically, we need to fill in some of the gaps, but we need to work fast and very fast. We think that 2020 up to 2050 is 30 years. But when you look at something, for example, in the grid development sector, once you have the inauguration of a project or design of a project, it takes around 10 years to build an interconnection line once it goes throughout all the paths, all the processes. So design, it has to go through the permitting stages. So look at what's the environmental effects of putting these lines in, what's the social effects of putting these lines in. So although it seems like we have 30 years in reality, once you look at the build-out rates of all these technologies, we soon see that it's essential that we really just work as fast as possible and get ourselves organized and really take action. So that would be my final comment.
Thank you very much. Kristian, you have the last word.
Thank you. I'd make it very brief. Doubling down on decarbonization means doubling up on electricity. There's absolutely no doubt about that. That is the consistent finding of all major studies in this space. We now are facing a situation as society where it is crucial that governments make sure that their response to the corona crisis is at the same time a response to the climate crisis. They need to target their recovery plans towards the green transition and make sure that we invest in electrification as we try to recover from the corona crisis.
Thank you very much to all three of you. I think this was a very good first session, and I hand back.
Thank you to you, Dolf.
So this concludes the first session, and we will start again at 10:50, so it's in 8 minutes.
Thank you.